nice of you all to kind of stay back and attend this seminar or panel. What I'm going to do is, if I can just change things a little bit and request the panelists to make opening remarks lasting no more than 5 minutes. And I'll begin by saying what I said in the morning, but I see the audience is slightly different, so I will repeat it, seeking your indulgence. I think you're going to have a Global United Nations SDG Report 2023, which is going to be released on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly on 18th and 19th of September, not very far from today. You know there is a UN tamasha called the General Assembly. It's kind of a jamboree which happens in the month of September. New Yorkers hate it. Vaseline knows that. All diplomats are allowed to park wherever they want, so the New Yorkers hate that. So we don't pay parking fines, as you know, at least in my previous life. So I think the important thing, though, is that the UN SDG report has already released an advanced version, and since all of you have bothered to stay back for this session, I would very earnestly request you to take a look at it. The advanced version of the unedited version of the UN Global Sustainable Development Goal Report 2023 is available online. Just Google UN, you will get it. It makes for very somber reading, frankly. The UN Secretary General says that half of the world has been left behind, and if governments don't take actions along with the private sector and the stakeholders, this is going, the UN 2030 agenda, he thinks, or I'm quoting him, will be the epitaph of the world we would have seen. So he goes as far as to, he's really sounding the warning bells, if you like. This is serious. On most of the yardsticks, SDG, countries are just way behind. You can use the pandemic as an excuse, and if nothing else works, you can always blame Putin, right? That's what we do these days. I'm joking. So you can say the Russian war in Ukraine, the pandemic, whatever. The fact of the matter is these goals are not going to be realized unless, this is the halfway mark, by the way. 2015 is when it was established. 2030 is when those goals were meant to be achieved by governments. We are exactly at the halfway mark, and it doesn't sound good. In the light of this, to kind of say beyond SDGs, envisioning a world of global sustainability seems a tad ambitious to me, because the immediate question that arises, at least in my mind, is implement the wretched goals now, and then we will talk about future goals. But as Duncan said, and he's still there, Duncan said very rightly, and I think he has inside information, I agree with it, by the way, he thinks that the SDG goals themselves will not change, but the targets, I think, will be tweaked. That's what you said, Duncan. I completely agree. Because the goals themselves are so broad. I mean, there is an expression called wicked problems in life. And SDG is a wicked problem, not liable to easy solutions, and therefore it goes on and on. So I don't believe the goals themselves will change radically, but I want to know where our panelists are coming from. So, Mathew, you're going to hate me for this, but if I can put you on the mat, we will start with you, and then I'll go to the lady, and as usual, my colleague and senior colleague Sudarshan will have the last word, as you always do. So Mathew, if I can request you to please.
Absolutely, you never have to worry about asking me to have the first word. I'm always sort of ready for multiple different permutations of when we need to speak, so very happy to do it. So my name's Mathew Johnston. I am the Minister Counsellor for Education and Research here at the Australian High Commission. That's just a fancy diplomat name for I'm in charge of our education department, our engagements in education here in India and across the region. I'm an education diplomat, so I work for our Ministry of Education in Australia, and Australia's a little bit unusual around the world in sending subject matter specialists or experts from line ministries out on diplomatic missions. We're very lucky to be able to do that. So my background and what I'm going to talk about here is I guess SDG 4 is the obvious one, right? access to quality education, promoting greater accessibility and inclusivity. And we discussed this fair bit in the education working group for G20 this year. I was a member of that working group, and really, I think, as you would rightly expect for a room full of bureaucrats from education ministries, we were quite obsessed with it. And thinking about, what are the next steps beyond the SDGs that we as members of the G20 wanted to try and enunciate to the world. I would say India's presidency was very ambitious and was trying to drive us, and did drive us very well towards being more practical and action-oriented, towards how you actually implement the SDGs in practice, because the statements are lofty, the targets are very ambitious, and the means to get there are not unified. So the G20 was an opportunity to try and say, what are some of the means we can work to together and agree on to have some hope of getting towards some of those SDGs? So we focused on foundational learning and numeracy. We focused on tools for implementing greater access to education. There was a lot about the use of technology. How do you ensure that technology and digital tools are of high quality? Because it's fine to say, oh, we're going to, as we've done in Australia for many, many decades, have the School of the Air, where people living in remote or far-flung communities can have access to schooling by virtue of the technology that was available at that particular point in time. But if you don't have agreed quality standards around the use of that technology, if you don't have clear goals around the outcomes you want to get in terms of learning, what's the point? Yes, digital technology is very good, but it doesn't sort of replace the forum like what we have here, where we can interact with each other sort of face to face. There are a number of other areas as well that we all focused on: lifelong learning, connecting industry and universities, and fostering greater collaboration. And we made some suggestions in the outcome document, which is published for everyone to see, about how we want to, as G20 countries, collaborate better and stronger on education. One of the areas that I think we can do better, leveraging what Duncan was talking about as one of the three opportunities, and that's partnerships. And certainly Australia and India are great partners. Our universities work very closely with each other, and they work in a lot of traditional fields. But now what we're starting to see is a proliferation of collaborations in early childhood education, in teacher education. Some of these are core disciplines that actually can make change in the world, I think, and certainly from my side of things, and the strategy we want to drive is more opportunities for countries to collaborate on those that are kind of the building blocks for building greater accessibility to quality education that can shape pedagogy and methodology around digital tools. So that's my opening remarks. Thank you, Mohan. I think I've probably gone a little bit too long, but we'll come back.
Mathew, that was perfect, and I'm glad you introduced yourself. I'm particularly fortunate in having two ladies on my panel, and both from the private sector. So that's fantastic, because otherwise academicians tend to be an incestuous lot. We're talking among ourselves all the time, thinking that we know more than others and so on. Bureaucrats are even worse. Since I have been one in my past life, I can testify to that as well. So in that sense, the private sector tends to be more practical, pragmatic, and action-oriented. So if I can turn to Ms. Malik, Director Kearney, if you can say your piece, introduce yourself also, and then I'll turn to Ms. Garg. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohan, and thank you so much for having me here. To begin with, I have to say that I really love the food that you get at Tapri. And I can tell you how I know about Tapri after I finish my session. A lot of people were asking me when I was coming on the panel, what does a people leader come on a ESG sustainability forum and talk about? While Kearney is one of the global leaders as far as sustainability and ESG is concerned, I'm really not a practitioner, so to say, or a specialist. But I'm really coming from the vantage point of being the key stakeholder, which is in the front and the center of this entire discussion that we're having, which is really the people right? The policymakers, the students, the people at the grassroots level that are actually the ones that are bringing about the change by doing lifestyle changes, by, participating in a circular economy of, reducing, reusing, recycling, the things, the world that we are living in. So I would just like to, very quickly just put it in a very small framework, which I find easy to understand as somebody who's not a sustainability expert, but somebody who is a part of an organization which is not just sustainable, but working towards being a regenerative business. And a regenerative business is really a business which is not just looking at reducing the negative impact of the business that we are doing, but also looking at, how do we protect, do we nurture, how do we replenish our impact by just doing a positive transformation. And this model that I'd like to call it's an ACE model. So what it means is, first point is really about awareness, and Duncan was also talking about it. And Mohan was also saying, we are so far from where we should be. 2013 and ahead seems like very, very optimistic perspective. And so A for me really stands about awareness, right? Where we are in terms of the awareness that we've been able to create in our organizations, in our country, in the world that we are living in, right? And I think the awareness levels are still very low, and that's the reason we are not able to see any kind of affirmative action, because for everybody sitting in the room, there is a WIFM. You know what a WIFM is? No? It's what's in it for me, right? It's a terminology that a lot of you use, right? What's in it for me? So when you talk to somebody about sustainability, when you talk about making life choices that impact the environment, at a broader level, everybody's thinking, what's in it for me? I mean, I will continue to do what I do, and my small change is not going to create an impact. So I think that awareness of how each one of us contributes to the larger purpose of being, bringing about an economy which is sustainable is very, very important. The second that Duncan was talking about, Mathew also talked about, is really about collaboration, right? Cross collaborations that are happening not just between countries that have the technology, the know-how, and we did see that during COVID, right, where everybody was fighting to try and figure out how do we get the vaccines across from one country to the other, right? It's a classic example of how things could have been done better but did not happen. So it's really about cross collaboration. And one example I want to share very quickly is 1705 universities that Duncan was talking about. One of them, University of Cambridge, we have collaborated with them. And their Sustainability Leadership Council actually runs sessions and programs for Kearney and leaders like us, where people can go in and get new age understanding about sustainable finance, for instance, sustainable food systems, sustainability and climate change. So I think a larger collaboration between academia and the corporate sector is very, very critical at this stage, because there is just a lot of new age thinking which is happening, but it's happening in silos, and it's not getting cross functional. It's not going across from either academia to the corporate, and similarly the corporate has not been contributing as much to the academia as well. And the last is really just evaluating where we are, right? The matrices that again Duncan was talking about. Where have we reached? What is the pace of change that we've brought? Is that even relevant to where we are? And do we need to change the targets that we are trying to share? And I think every organization needs to hold itself accountable in terms of, what are the matrices that I'm measuring, right? If it's about the emissions that we're doing, reduction of, carbon footprint. How are we doing on the whole DEI index, for instance, right? Do we have, leaders like Mollshree, who are, bringing in gender and thinking diversity? And I think that evaluation then kind of closes the loop in terms of showing us the mirror as to where we are.
So Rakhee, before moving to Mollshree, you said that there has got to be a better connect between the academia and the private sector. You'd rather the government get out of the way, or do you feel government has a role?
I could throw that back to you, but you should never answer a question with a question in terms of, what is the government done till date that you think that the government needs to be there. I think there is a role that the government has to play. I don't think you can take the government out of the equation. But I still feel that there is a lot more that the corporate sector and the academia can do directly as well, right? I mean, I'm sure all of us are here not because somebody asked us to be here, right? I mean, because you wanted to be here.
So thank you. No, I think you've kind of left it tantalizingly in the air. I'd like to take it up later, not least because I was associated with the government for 36 years. I think in some SDGs, I tend to think the government has a critical role to play, poverty or health. But in other areas, it seems to me the government is ill-suited to play any role, but that's my personal view, and we can discuss it more. I see Mathew is nodding in agreement, so we will take it forward. Mollshree, you are from the KPMG. Great pleasure and honor to have you.
Likewise,
Why don't you
Mohan,
go?
thank you. Thanks. So, everyone, I actually navigated the wicked problem of rain-filled roads from Gurgaon to Delhi. So I'm glad you all are still here. And I heard a lot about the lunch. Unfortunately, missed it. So when I was sort of preparing my thoughts for what I'd like to share today, when I read SDGs, I was happy that it said beyond the SDGs. Otherwise, unlike Duncan, I would have had to memorize all of them. I wouldn't challenge you to ask me which one relates to the other one. My perspective on a couple of these topics. So let me maybe look at, the way I look at it is maybe there are these three concentric circles, right? Right at the heart of it is what industry can do on its own to further SDGs, but even beyond SDGs, because we've been talking about CSR for eons now, right? But CSR has a very different objective to my mind, or a much more limited objective, let me say that. But from an overall sustainability perspective, I think you've got to sort of put your money where your mouth is. And in that respect, for example, at KPMG, we have a very aggressive decarbonization goal of our own. And you will already see change at the grassroots level happening inside our offices in terms of the use of electric vehicles, or no plastic, and all the moving to on-site PPA, so we're not using the grid's electricity, a bunch of that stuff. But also from a social perspective, linking in more to the SDGs, we have a very large commitment towards upskilling of youth across the globe. And this is not just in India, it's happening globally. Then if I take a step outside of that sort of KPMG industry circle, the next circle I look at in terms of, and sorry, it's I'm a consultant, I think, in frameworks, but the next circle that I look at it is that overlap between the government and industry, right? And I think, Rakhee, I have a slightly different point of view there. I think the government's done a lot, whether it's globally or in India, and some of the regulation that's being brought into the country is actually mind-boggling. Now, how well will we do with implementing it is a different story. And that's always been, I think, our challenge. But I'm very proud to say that we as a country have been the front runners in many legislations. Something as simple as regulating ESG ratings, which are really being exploited across the globe. And I can tell you as a practitioner, to having our 2030 green hydrogen vision, to already having a concept around carbon markets for India. So I think there's a lot happening, and industry needs to support that. So in our projects, we do a lot of work with the government to help write these frameworks and create implementation roadmaps. And last but not the least, academia. And I look at it that, again, it's just my point of view. You could put academia anywhere. It could be the first circle for any logical reasons. But from an academia perspective, I think the way we've got to look at sustainability, and so let me take a step back before I go to that. Any engagement that we do for clients today as KPMG, I would be shocked if someone came and told me there was not an ESG or sustainability angle to it. So the people I need in my teams, right, are folks who understand sustainability exactly the same way that, let's say, 15 years ago, people started understanding technology. So we don't look at it as a separate skill set. We look at it as a foundational skill. And so the more we can cover it as, just like we cover analytics and technology with finance and accounting, or the basics of management in an MBA, and for that matter, even in undergrad, we should look at covering sustainability in that manner. And I think forums like these are great for us to use to collaborate in those areas, and would love to discuss that more.
So, Sudarshan, it's my great pleasure to hand you the mic. You please say your piece, of course, but I'm also eager to know from you. I tend to associate the United Nations with macabre optimism. You know, they never, ever kind of sound pessimistic. In light of that, for the UN Secretary General to say what he said, which is, you know, that this is bad, that the world is nowhere close to resolving any of these SDGs. He thinks half the world is left behind. So if you can also throw some light on whether he's deliberately trying to be provocative and moving governments to action, or is this, in your view, really a reflection of the state of the world? But please begin by saying your piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You made a comment about the phrase beyond SDGs as being somewhat bizarre. There is a problem with the SDG itself, with the term sustainable development. So I'll begin there. I worked in the United Nations Development Program for 22 years. I lived through the entire phase when the MDGs were formulated. After the 2000 Millennium Declaration, my countries quite rightly said the important thing for the world is human rights, development, and of course, peace and security. The United Nations system got to work saying the world leaders have agreed to broad goals, democracy, development, human rights. So we must now translate them into goals. Now, the inspiration for this was the head of UNICEF at one point, a wonderful leader called James Grant, who, when he became head of UNICEF, he said, "What's my job? You know, I can get access to meeting heads of state and governments." And UNICEF, of course, was set up as an emergency fund after the war for the protection of children. So he said he will go and ask heads of governments and states, say, "I've come to meet you. I want you to make me one promise. And I'll come back to you after 3-4 years maybe, and you must tell me that you've delivered on the promise that you give to me." And the one promise was immunize all the children in your country. And for some reason it worked. It really worked remarkably well. Heads of government said, "Oh, this man came from UNICEF, you know, good thing, and we made this promise." So governments around the world went up setting up cold chains and vaccines for children. And then the UN system, you know, so, oh, well, it worked in UNICEF, it worked with James Grant, it's got to work for every one of us. So all of these agencies got together and formulated the MDGs, right? But each one wanted it there. So there's a lovely account by Malik Brown, who's now the head of the Soros Foundation. He was head of UNDP. He says that when they were formulating the MDGs, they were sitting in a room and working it out. There was, you know, various agencies. UNESCO was there, and WHO, and so on. And he said he was coming out of the room, and then he saw the head of the United Nations Environment Program walk in. Now he's based in Nairobi, not in New York. And he said, "Oh my God, you know, we forgot an environment. This man is going to come and make a, maybe, you know, raise hell about it." So he says he rushed back to the room and said, "You know, we need a goal on environment." So that's how the MDGs got formulated. Didn't get much buy-in from governments. And then when the results were very sort of, they said, "No, you know, the Indian government said, what are these MDGs? Who formulated them? We never signed up to them at all. You know, so why are you coming and saying MDGs?" It took a while for the government of India to then say, "Okay, we'll produce a MDG report." Now the SDGs, they said, the UN said, "Oh, we've learned a lesson. We'll be very, you know, open. We'll consult civil society. We'll appoint a high-level panel. David Cameron, Susilo Bambang Udiono, various other people, and extensive discussions. And so the more people you have, the more you consult, more things are important. So we ended up from 8 goals to 17. And the thing is now, as we say, it's very difficult for heads of state and governments to remember what are the 17 SDGs, right? I mean, you know, it's like having an exam. So this is part of the process by which these things get done. The goal, of course, is important. You know, you're thinking of it in the right direction. My problem is with putting together sustainable development as a phrase, because there is a tension between sustainability and a tension with development. And development, as we understand it, for the most part now. I joined the UNDP, leaving the Ford Foundation, and a very nice work that I enjoyed doing there because of the Human Development Report. That report, initiated by Amartya Sen and Mahbubullah, said let's focus on how well people are doing rather than how well an economy is doing. So let's displace gross domestic product with the Human Development Index. That'll tell you how well are people healthy, are they getting educated, have they access to knowledge, and do they have the minimum that you need for your creature comforts, you know, whatever you need. And so any income above what is minimally required is discounted in the index. It doesn't add to the index. So this index was produced. I mean, there were criticisms, Amartya Sen said, oh, this is an unweighted index. No self-respecting statistician would accept it. And Mahbubullah had replied to him saying, the gross domestic product is also a vulgar and crude index. And we have to, supplant that. Unfortunately, the UNDP, having produced these reports, in its allocation of funding for countries, still uses GDP. It doesn't use, somebody could come and tell the UNDP, physician, heal thyself. Why aren't you following your own advice that what matters is the Human Development Index and not the... So there is, I think, conflating sustainability and development in one phrase. Sustainable development means your aim is development. But what I'd say beyond this, going beyond, there's a need to go beyond it, is to say that the planet is at risk. You see, not all good things need to be made into some major priority. The language of rights, not everything that's desirable becomes a right. A right is something like a trump card. You should be very, very selective about what you say is a fundamental right. In the same way, you should be very, very selective about what are your goals. And just multiplying goals from 8 to 17 is not going to do the job. The most important goal now and beyond SDGs is climate. It's a planet. And I think we have to go back to the grant idea and say governments should focus on one thing. What are they doing to save the planet? We've come to a very dire stage, and so that's beyond it. So I'd say that sustainable development puts a focus on development. It makes countries still think in terms of, we will be a $5 trillion economy, $10 trillion economy. That's not going to help in any way the quality of life of human beings. And we need to remember that. So there is a need to go beyond the SDGs in that sense, to think of sustainability as the key goal and not think in terms of GDP growth rates and 5 trillion and 10 trillion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudarshan. That was fascinating, and thank you so much for taking as much time as you did. Every bit of it was worth it, because I thought you kind of set the broad canvas, if you like, the backdrop against which we can discuss further. I think I can easily segue from what you are saying, which is that, not every goal is important. I'm going to be a little provocative, and at least coming from India's perspective, and that's a bit of the problem I think we're having. One of the things that this UN Sustainable Development Goal Report 2023 is going to focus on is how in each of these 17 goals, countries have fallen behind. On some, you fall behind very much. On others, you make some progress. Fascinating to listen to Duncan that poverty, which is SDG 1, gets the least amount of research. That is, frankly, Duncan, that is shocking. I'm left speechless. I mean, India is kidding itself if it doesn't contribute to SDG 1 and it keeps talking of SDG 4 and SDG 8. Because, frankly, I mean, I know the multidimensional poverty index is out, and I know we are making claims about poverty, at least extreme poverty, having reduced, but God knows we have 800 million people who are still availing of Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, which Duncan translated is the Prime Minister's food relief program, where we give 1 kilo of lentils and 5 kilos of food grains for virtually nothing, and 800 million people. And the program is poor. So I mean, okay, this is not scientific to say this, but you could easily argue that 800 million people are poor in India. Whereas the multidimensional poverty index talks of 221 million people being poor. So I think we have a problem right there. But Mathew, if I can come to you, and I'm going to, of course, follow the same order, if you like. My problem is, how can a country like India talk of inequalities, which is very important at one level, inequalities, which is goal number 10, if you are not making much progress on goal number 2, which is zero hunger? Everybody knows we have a problem of stunting, we have a problem of wasting of children, we have a problem of hunger. We shouldn't be having a problem of hunger because I know in the Food Corporation of India godowns, the rats eat the food. And so it's basically not availability which is the problem. So my next question is, assuming in 2030, we are not going to get, and this is a big assumption to make, but that's what it looks like. That is, not all of these goals are going to be fulfilled. So in 2030, I agree with Duncan that we are not going to completely reinvent the goals. Some priorities may be resettled, but not the goals themselves. So how do you order yourself among these priorities? I know Australia doesn't need to bother very much, perhaps. I don't know the situation in your country. It can't be as dire as India in any case. But I think for India, it seems to me that some goals are definitely more important. And resources are not unlimited in India. If you take climate change, and Sudarshan is absolutely right, if you don't have a planet, then there is no point in talking about 10 billion and 15 billion. There are not going to be no people left. But I think the fact of the matter is we have repeatedly made it clear to the international community that we are not capable of achieving everything in climate change without financial help. And mind you, we are the only major economy now being asked to follow a low carbon pathway to development, by the way. With due respect, the Western countries have done what you have done. You've burnt coal and, and done whatever you want to do. China has done the rest. China now consumes more coal than the rest of the world put together. China's emissions are more than all the emissions of developed countries put together. So the only country that is being told, hey, don't make the mistakes that we did. We screwed up big time, but you don't do it. Fine, we won't do it, but you'll have to help us not do it. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to be able to do it on our own. So anyway, to come back to what I'm saying, poverty, hunger, these are issues which to my mind, are really fundamental before I can start giving people a wonderful, decent job, decent employment, decent work, which is an SDG. Life under the ocean. There was a young student who said, you guys are talking about land, you're not talking about ocean. You have a point when you say that. But then when the WTO is negotiating a fisheries agreement, I mean, there is no fish left in any case on the Indian coastline. All the fish is exhausted. So we need to find livelihood for the fishermen before I can bother about the high seas and the oceans. So I'm deliberately trying to be provocative, but it seems to me to say I'm going to treat every single SDG on the same footing. All 16 SDGs are important. The 17th SDG talks of cooperation, and I'll do it. That, to my mind, as somebody who's worked in the government, it seems to me it is naive in the extreme, frankly. That is not how governments will approach it. A government of India, in one of the books that I'm going to write and it's forthcoming, I talk of the poverty veto. In all international negotiations that India does, and I have been part of some, there is a poverty veto. I'm not going to bother about the middle class, the upper middle class, but I'm bothered about the people at the bottom of the pyramid. How is this community going to be affected? So are you, to cut a long story short, and I'm sorry I took time, can you really prioritize, or do you think, no, that's not the way to go? Every single SDG is important. Thank you.
That was a really thought-provoking question, and I have a lot of things in my mind about how to try and tackle that, but I suspect I'm probably not going to do it any justice to that. So I'm going to reflect on previous roles I've held in the Australian government, maybe to answer this, Mohan, because I don't want to sit here and say to India what it should do, because I actually think that's also part of the problem, which you alluded to. And that's not the approach that Australia takes in our partnership with India. And I think that's why we're different to some of the other countries that you mentioned in terms of the Western world using up natural resources and contributing to the mess we are all in today. I think, yes, we all have a responsibility in that, but I would say the role we play internationally from Australia is different to some of our, Western countries, and I'll just sort of leave it at that, because otherwise I get myself into an undiplomatic incident, and that's never good for anybody. Before the role that I'm doing now, many, many moons ago, I worked in our social services department in Australia, and I worked on welfare programs that were, by and large, focused on people on income support or welfare, people, some of our Indigenous peoples as well, who have had a terrible lot in life. This is no secret. You can read anything and see that the lot for Indigenous Australians is not good. The gap between attainment in education, health outcomes between non-Indigenous and Indigenous are not good. And so some of the things that I was working on many moons ago really went to that point about, and my personal view is, if you don't have a full stomach, how do you learn? If you don't have a secure shelter, again, how do you learn? So I worked on a number of different programs that were about, some weren't popular. Government sometimes makes decisions and undertakes things that aren't popular. So I worked on a welfare conditionality program where we managed people's incomes for people who were seen as vulnerable, who couldn't manage incomes, as a way to try and stabilise their circumstances, to try and ensure children were fed, children were safe, and these sorts of things. So I'm a bit of the view that if you can get some of those foundations right, people have healthy, nutritious meals, family life is stable, because the family does, by and large, particularly if you look at countries like India, take care of people as opposed to the state, which probably does more in some other countries. If you can start to stabilise those things, you can then start to tackle other entrenched disadvantages and vulnerabilities, such as learning, such as immense inequality. So I think I'm a bit of a believer in that you need to get that piece right. I probably very inarticulately said many times, and had many an argument with my friends who are sort of more international human rights lawyers. I sort of said, and I don't mean this to be pejorative, you can't eat your human rights. So you need to get some of the fundamentals done and the foundations done, and then I think you can start to build on top of that. So that's how I would answer your question, and reflecting on a bit of the role as a policy bureaucrat in previous jobs I've done before diplomacy in social policy, where sometimes you have to take those hard decisions and focus in on that, which may, curtail in a temporary way people's rights or ability to kind of exercise some of those rights, for a pathway towards safety and bringing people out of poverty. That's probably how I'd answer. I don't know if it got to what you wanted, but you've made me stretch my brain, so that's good for an afternoon.
Oh, perfect, Matthew. It takes me back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but we will not go down that road. Rakhee, what is your take on all this?
I might go down that route, right?
Please.
Because I'm a psychologist, and you cannot have a conversation without Maslow's need hierarchy theory. The fundamental rule that you were talking about and that Mathew was also talking about, that when your basic needs in terms of food, in terms of shelter are not taken care of, the expectation for people to have more aspirations in terms of better life, health, education are almost unrealistic, right? They are actually unrealistic, right? So for the person on the road who does not know how he's going to get his second square meal, to expect to have other understanding around how we can make this world more sustainable, what does it mean to have good health hygiene, it's not possible. It's not going to happen. So it's very important for the government, at least, to have a priority listed in terms of what they want to attack first and in what order do they want to move. Because a lot of these are actually not independent of each other. There is a correlation between most of them, right? But if you look at the first 4 SDGs that we have, if we get even 3 of those in place, the others will actually automatically come into place, right? So when I give people food to eat, when I give them sustenance, when they know that they do not have to worry about where the next meal is coming from, they can focus more in terms of what do I really need to do in terms of my health, right? Am I in a position where my children can get educated? And when their next generation gets educated, that circle becomes complete, right? So educating them is also one of the key priorities, right? You feed them, you give them a good lifestyle, but for the next generation to make a difference, for their lives to change, education becomes equally critical and important. And I agree with Mollshree when she was saying, a lot of good things have already happened. The government has intervened, and there are a lot of good steps that have been taken, even in how we look at education and how we provide education, through our central government schools, through our state government schools. But I think we are still way, way far from where we really should be. But very important to prioritize and get our act together. Like you said, we are still figuring out whether it's 800 million, whether it's 202 million. If we don't even know what we are talking about, I don't know what we're going to address, right? And again, the waste management, I think is so critical. Our resources are limited, but whatever resources we have, I think our supply chain and our movement to the end user is just not sustainable. It's something which has not been thought through, and that's where a lot of our programs are not working the way they should work.
Thank you. So, Mollshree, in addition to the point that is being discussed, if you can also bring the gender bit, that's kind of a cross-cutting issue, and I think it can be deemed important enough by a lot of people. So if I can ask you to address that.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, I want to build on what Rakhee said, because while Mohan and I agree that if there's no food in the stomach, that saying we have in India, right? You can't even worship if you don't have food in your stomach. I mean, I think that's a given. But I also believe in the philosophy that you can't just give people fish. You have to teach them to fish. And that goes to what Rakhee was saying, is you can't look at these as being sort of one after the other, but many of these goals have to run in parallel. The whole poverty alleviation cannot happen without education, without skilling, and those cannot be a second step. The way we've lifted millions of people out of poverty in India, in China, has been through gainful employment and education. And that's what is guaranteeing their next square meal, right? So I think that we need to look at it in that light for sure. Going to your question about gender, I think from a sustainability perspective, there's a lot that's being done in terms of, specific bank accounts for women, cooking fuel, maybe even quotas in educational institutes. There's a lot happening. I think where the challenge is really in being able to get our fellow men colleagues to look at the problem in the same way. So I can, again, speaking of my area of expertise, when we do DE&I, right, diversity, equity, and inclusion work for our clients or within the company, there's a lot that gets asked in terms of, is this an unfair advantage to maybe half the world's population? Right, so there is a lot that needs to be done in terms of understanding the role that women play, especially in a culture like India. where, not only the home provider, but the care provider, and can she start becoming the care enabler, as I like to call it, rather than being the sole care provider? And that's going to take a huge mindset change before it can happen. It started, and testament to, I think 50% of this room is women students, but there's a lot more that needs to happen, and a lot of support that needs to come from men.
So, Sudarshan, if I can also request you to elaborate just a little bit. You made a wonderful, detailed opening statement, but I know we agree on most things, by the way, Sudarshan and me, but I do have this issue about population. And I want to raise it again because there are some young minds, inquisitive minds in front of us, and maybe I have my views on population. I will not bore you with those now. But if you do agree with the broad thrust of what is being talked about, and if you think some goals are what we are veering around, if I am to summarize, is to say that not all SDGs will be important to a country, and which goals are more important than others will depend on the stage of development in which the country finds itself. You can definitely use the Human Development Index. See, at the end of the day, whether you use GDP per capita or you use the Human Development Index, India comes out bad in both. It's only GDP, and GDP is a direct proportion of the population, really. So the per capita GDP, we are being classified as a low-income economy by the World Bank. And the Human Development Report also puts us in the middle of Niger and Nigeria, with due respect to all those countries, with due respect to our country as well. We also find ourselves there. So in that sense, there is nothing much to choose. But the question for, I think, India is somehow we have to recognize that if as you, both Rakhee and Mollshree are saying, that at least poverty is linked to education, education is linked to hunger and the rest of it. Unless you educate somebody, you're not going to, that's the only passport to development in India. If that is the case, the challenge of education, which I mentioned in the morning, the crisis of quality, the crisis of inclusion, and the crisis of relevance, that's not going to leave us anytime soon. We need quality institutions. It takes years to build an educational institution, Jindal being a classic example. It takes 15, 20 years before you can have an institution of eminence or excellence. So how do you propose we deal with it?
Okay, I think that could be a consensus in this panel on, for India, poverty, right? Goal 1, which you lamented, features very little in Scopus listed research journals. The first thing to understand is that poverty is being reduced daily. We keep thinking of, there are poor people, we'll give the Pradhan Mantri, whatever Yojana, distribute free food. The language we use, safety net. It is almost as if we expect people to be knocked down over the precipice, and there will be some kind of a safety net so that they don't actually die, right? So the understanding of poverty alleviation, handouts, give them more subsidies to buy food grains that cause diabetes, that's not the point. The point is poverty is being produced because of the kind of system in which the world seems to be locked in. Now, globalized world. Now, I just make all of you think about what happened in Rana Plaza in Dhaka. Rana Plaza was a building in which women garment workers were working. They were part of a supply chain, and the garments they made are sold in Gap and Macy's in the United States. And it's only when that fire happened and so many of them died, we learned what it is that they were paid. What they were paid was above the minimum wage of Bangladesh, but nowhere near what it took to pay rent, to get a decent roof over their head, nowhere near what it took for them to get essential drugs if they happen to fall ill. So poverty in that sense is relative, right? It's not that defined by some minimum wage and you're above the minimum wage or above the poverty line. Adam Smith recognized it. He said for someone to walk on the streets of London without having a pair of leather shoes is humiliating, is shameful to that person, right? Everybody else who is somewhat well off has a decent standard of living, wears leather shoes, and here I am, I've got sackcloth on my feet, right? So we must understand that. So we must do something about tackling the system. So I'd say thinking beyond SDGs, there was one point at which the world, the United Nations tried to create a new economic order, an international economic order. That was shot down, and we were given a sop. Oh, there is such a thing as right to development. One day you will be where we are. Now, Gandhiji said, if it takes, a small island with a modest number of people, it takes that country for its prosperity to exploit the whole of the Indian subcontinent. And if India wants to be like them, have their standard of living, how many planets are there for us to exploit? So we have to first understand that we need to work together internationally to change the nature of the system that we have in the world. The ones that, in our country, the big corporates, look at over the period of the pandemic, who's got rich and by how much? All of the big corporate, with the Ambanis, the Adanis, all of them got terribly rich. And the rest, so you talk about inequality. It's the system. This system will produce inequality. This system will produce poverty. You need to go beyond the SDGs to address what kind of a fair system the world ought to have. That's going beyond the SDGs. And that should be a priority agenda. Because if we sign up to this system that we now have and say, oh, we will try to catch up, we will try to, give jobs to our people that China has abandoned because China has become a high-wage economy. If you're thinking in those terms, you're in the Rana Plaza mentality, and you'll never be able to get rid of poverty in this country or anywhere in the world. So the agenda is go beyond SDGs, question the system that the world now has. It's a system of safety nets, target, another military expression. Why? We're dealing with people. You don't need to target people. That's what I'd say.
So Sudarshan, just last point along with the other comments you've made. Universal basic income, is that a way out? Will it help?
It's a possibility. Generally governments think that, and bureaucrats in government think they know better. And that therefore they should, tell people what they should eat and what they should buy. And if you give them income, what the poor will do? They will drink it. It will all go in alcohol, and therefore let us do it. So you don't trust people, right? Civil servants, governments generally don't trust people. In the making of public policy, what is missing is the public. You don't consult the public. You make policies from top down. Right? So I think a little more trust to the people. So one of the advantages of universal basic income is you're telling the person, here it is. This income we know is enough for your creature comforts, is enough for you to send children to school and to get some basic health care. Now you deal with this. Handle it the way you want. Trust people to do that. No, we won't. You will say, no, we'll have to give you this, we'll have to give you that. Conditional transfers. Why conditional? Leave it to people's judgment. So I'm in favor of it. Okay. But the problem with universal is, of course, then you'd say, oh, you must target the needy and so on. But then the administrative cost is too much. It's like the administrative cost of GST. It's such a complicated mechanism. The administrative cost is phenomenal. The GST is actually not doing the government any good, I'd say, now, because it's not a simple system. So that's because you didn't consult the traders, you didn't consult the manufacturers, you didn't consult the companies. You created a GST by having dozens of rates and so on. So the way government needs to work and connect to its citizens has to change.
Okay, since Mathew is the only serving bureaucrat in the room, I'm retired, but I think there is a comment about bureaucrats, which is Mathew, with due apologies to you, bureaucrats are knowledge proof. So it doesn't matter, you know.
Am I being recorded? Because seriously.
So Mathew, last point, because I'm under instructions from my colleague Paddy that we should finish at 4. So much as this is interesting and I'm gaining enormously from it, we have 20 minutes more, so maybe one round and then a few questions from the floor, which I'm sure will come. So Mathew, if in 2030 you are UN Secretary General, you find that SDGs are going nowhere, would you suggest or would you recommend an emergency fund for regions which are lagging behind substantially? And the 2 regions I have in mind, and I'm having to stomach my patriotic pride here, one is Sub-Saharan Africa, but that's what it looks like, and I don't think it's going to change. One is Sub-Saharan Africa, the other is South Asia. And it is Indian pride which is making me say South Asia. Otherwise, I would have said India. The numbers are in India, but I'll say South Asia because there is Bangladesh, there's Pakistan, Nepal. I don't think they're going to be very much better. So these 2 regions are the only regions which are going to fall short substantially in 2030. We're not far from that. This is 2023, 7 years. What is it that you would suggest? Because how else do we handle this issue? You know, Latin America, I mean, China says, and I think it could be exaggerated, but I don't have reasons to believe it. They say they've gotten rid of extreme poverty. Of course, every country has poverty. Extreme poverty is now defined by the United Nations at $2.15 per head per day. Like it or not, 2017 purchasing power parity. So at that level, China says we've got no extreme poverty. India, in my view, minimum 220 million, which has been confirmed by the multidimensional poverty index. When they say, the problem I have with multidimensional poverty index is it mixes real physical poverty, which is standard of living, with something like health and education. Because you see, if you have 98% school enrollment, it has the pernicious effect of reducing poverty in my country. All you have to do is put kids at school. And then you don't know whether they're dropping out at 10th, dropping out at 12th, are the girls getting married? We don't know all that. But we've achieved, similarly, electrification, 98%. But nobody's asking whether electricity is 24/7. So that's the other problem that we have. So we have those issues, but I don't want you to bother about those. My question is, and I want to ask this of every panelist, it's a serious problem. 2030, I see only 2 regions falling behind substantially. And we are talking millions, by the way. We are not talking thousands. That's why I'm saying Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. What do we do? We can't go on like this, keep saying, okay, we'll give you another 10 years, do the same thing. That's not going to work. So I want you to put your thinking hat, and from an Australian perspective, whatever, I mean, where do we go from there? Come 2030, what do we do?
Look, it's really difficult, I think. So I think there's a couple of layers that I would try and answer this, and I'm probably woefully unqualified to answer it, frankly. The first is, in my personal view, I think as a bureaucrat who maybe doesn't trust and wants to sort of intervene in people's lives and these kinds of things, as we've heard about on this panel, you know, I think incentives can work. And if you're taking kind of a rights-based approach or looking at it from a fairness or equity kind of perspective, why not have a fund for targeted to areas or regions that need assistance to get to where, I guess, the world population would like everyone to be? Why not? There's probably a lot of, you know, social justice-based arguments for that. And the 2 regions you highlighted, I guess, as well had that, you know, very strong experience around European colonialism as well to contend with. And so perhaps people can make an argument about these sorts of things, setting back regions, and therefore to give everyone a leg up and to try and bring to some sort of certain level, there is a good reason for doing that. I can kind of see the rationale for that. Do we think that would happen? I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest, because I think, to your point, sir, about the, you know, what do people expect kind of in return? There is that expectation is always there. I think it'd be a very difficult kind of argument, and how do you make the sort of, and on what goals or what data do you use to make that decision? So, look, it's a really difficult thing to do. My personal view is that I am a big fan of safety nets. I'm a big fan of putting a bolster under people, because without that, sometimes you will lose talent. So I'm a bit maybe old-fashioned. I think there are good values and for welfare states as they've been historically conceived, because, you know, if you don't have the means to get in to a system, your talent can go unnoticed. And I'm sure that's probably what's happening in both of these regions because of entrenched extreme poverty and other things. So I'm quite a fan of those kinds of policies, unashamedly.
Thank you, Mathew. No, that's as good a response as you can give. And this is a difficult question. I don't think there are any right answers. But Rakhee and Mollshree, when you address this issue, if I can also ask you to note that we are the only major country which doesn't have a social safety net. But we have also moved, and to be fair to the government, my past employer, I must also say that we've moved from an entitlement approach to a rights-based approach. I will have you know that the Food Security Act talks of the right to food, and that's why we have a problem. As Bibek Debroy has written in the paper, 75% of the rural population and 50% of the urban population is entitled to these food grains and lentils. That's why we have 800 million people. Rich or poor, it doesn't matter. So then we have the right to education. That's what people are talking about. And then the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council has said now that right to environment is a fundamental right, a safe environment. So there is this rights-based approach as well. I don't know whether people in India, whether it's become a class action suit, I have to ask lawyers as to whether people can go to the courts and say that this was my right and I'm not getting it. A right to education is a fundamental right. So I'm thinking, why can't lawyers think along those lines and maybe, you know, I hope I'm not accused of sedition or anything. I'm no longer with the government. But, you know, if it is a right, then it should be a right. It should be a fundamental right available. I mean, one of the interesting things I read about that, there is a wonderful summit which took place in 2022, and people may be interested. Transforming Education Summit, also conducted by the United Nations, 2022. And I was going through those. Most of it is very somber again. But one thing which attracted my attention, positive news, is that the gaps in education when it comes to gender is fast disappearing. The report says the discrimination that you see in education is by income and location, not gender, which is good. At least, you know, correct. So I think I wanted you to take note of all this and then, of course, say your piece about how we can move forward. Thank you.
I guess going back to the core question, right, and as we say, if we knew these answers, we'd solve for world peace. I think that's, Mohan, what you're asking us to do. But yeah, I will take my a stab at it. Unlike Mathew, I'm more of a capitalist, and I think that that safety nets are fine for really the very bottom of the pyramid. But again, the issue of how large is that and who sits in that is something we've still not been able to answer. But as I said earlier, I think some of the best ways to eradicate some of these problems are through education, skilling, right, and business growth. And I think that's how some of the largest countries in the world have done it, and that's how we will not get there by 2030, like you said, Mohan, but there is no other silver bullet, I think, but to stay on this path and to continue to implement it with complete authenticity. That's where I think we are falling short. And from to your question about the rights, I think there are many cases in the courts today related to the right to education, right? And I'm not aware of anything related to the right to food security. That one is actually boggles the mind if you think of it and our distribution system and everything. But right to education is there, and we've all seen numerous movies around why students of the lower income strata maybe do not adjust in a school where they have free seats. There are a number of socio-economic conditions that come in the way. And I think that's where we need to support, whether it's the industry or the academia. We need to support them with those basics of what they wear to school and how they behave in class, and to bring that equality so that the right to education can become a reality. And I think that's the way to go.
Thank you, Mollshree. Rakhee?
Yeah, I think through all the conversation that we've been doing, there is just a fundamental gap in terms of what's available and what actually goes down and, is actually received by the people that it's supposed to be meant for, right? So even when you talk about right to education or you talk about the food bill, I'm not even sure how many people actually at the end of the day see the side that, the government has actually planned it for, right? Where you're talking about, food wastage, where you're talking about right to education. Well, the stats are great, but the fact of the matter is that if we had taught our women 20 years back, you would have had a lot more women leaders sitting in rooms across the world, right? And the fact is that we're still not there. And like Mollshree said, we have to keep at it. It's good to get to a point where, somebody says, yeah, you know what, I'm going to get so much more funds to get. But the point is, I don't think there is a lack of resources beyond a point, even in India. I think it's more in terms of how we are implementing some of the, things that we've put together. There is a lack in terms of the infrastructure that supports implementation. If we are able to solve that, I don't think we need a situation where in 2030, we need to have this exodus of funds really coming in or need to have a safety net. But yes, it's intent, implementation, and then somebody sitting there and saying, where are we? Did we meet that goal, or do we still have some way to go?
Thank you, Rakhee. Since I'm in the middle of people who are interested in education, and we all are, I must tell you a personal anecdote. I was posted as India's Deputy High Commissioner to Sri Lanka for 4 years. So I was based in Colombo. And a Sri Lankan Vice Chancellor once told me, Mohan, that I think India has got higher education right and primary education terribly wrong. And he went on to say that Sri Lanka has got primary education right and higher education completely wrong. And I think there is something to it, because in Sri Lanka, where I was posted, as I said, there's 99% literacy. And you don't have to go around telling women in Sri Lanka, please have only 2 children. 75 years after independence, we are continuing to say, hum do, hamare do. Not so much, but I genuinely think, and I think I've had this conversation with my good friend Sudarshan, I'm going through Mahatma Gandhi's speeches and sayings, and Nehru's as well. If only, for example, hypothetically, I mean, these are all great men, no question, but if one of them had said, every girl should go to school, forget the boys. By definition, all boys are useless, myself included. But putting a girl in school, more seriously, putting a girl in school is of enormous benefit for the society. Everybody knows that. All they had to do was put every girl in the school. In 1947, Sri Lanka became independent in 1947. Sri Lanka is not richer than India. I hope you'll agree. At least in 1947, how did they manage that? And why didn't we manage it? It's a question, because, if only all girls at that time had gone to school, then you wouldn't have had to teach them about reproductive rights and having only 2 kids, blah, blah, blah. The whole thing would have been so very different. But anyway, that's something for the historians to think about, where we went wrong, where we went right. On the other hand, the establishment of institutions like the Indian Institute of Technology, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, no question, good, very good. But my question is, what about the primary schools for girls? So anyway, that's a question. Sudarshan, 2030, what do you do? A special SDG summit just for South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa? Because everybody else would have just sailed forward. So what do we do with these two regions, which are, I think, proving to be stubborn when it comes to resolutions in terms of poverty, in terms of hunger, in terms of child stunting, and so on?
I just said that we need to seriously look at the world economic system. Sub-Saharan Africa, the World Bank and the IMF started a program called structural adjustment. And after several years, Richard Jolly had to write a book called Structural Adjustment with a Human Face, because the structural adjustment programs neither produced macroeconomic stability nor reduced poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. That means that the world economic system based on the Bretton Woods institutions, what was until recently called the Washington Consensus, is not doing the world any good, and it has resulted in the exploitation of natural resources in many parts of the world, whether it's Myanmar now through the aegis of China, or Africa with all the corporations that have worked there, and the land grabbing that goes on in Ethiopia and other places. So I really think that we need to look at the world economic system. I don't want to use labels like, oh, we want a socialist system or a capitalist system. I think this is a system that puts countries into debt. You talked about Sri Lanka. What happened to Sri Lanka? It got into debt. The management of the economy was such that, you know, they thought, oh, big infrastructure, build a big port in Hambantota, build huge airports, borrow the money for it, never mind. And what happened to Sri Lanka? So many countries in the world are debt inflicted. We are not too far away in India from that. And that is because of this system that pushes debt. You know, at that time it looks very attractive to take the loan, and then you've got to repay. A great part of India's budget goes into debt repayment right now. Taxpayers pay 15% of what the government has to spend. So where's the rest coming from? It's debt, right? So I think we need to look at the economic system seriously. Otherwise, you will not just have South Asia not doing very well and Sub-Saharan Africa not doing very well, but many more countries will join this group.
Okay. With that dire warning, thank you very much.